Welcome to Philosophy Hub, the Philosophy Cafe. I'm so glad you could pull up a chair and join us today.
It's wonderful to be here. We have a really incredible stack of materials to get through today.
We really do. And if you enjoy this kind of deep dive, exploring these profound ideas together to try and build a more thoughtful world, please take a second to like and share this session. It really helps support our mission here at the Philosophy Cafe.
Absolutely. The support means everything.
So today we are opening up a rather fascinating and, to be honest, slightly unsettling stack of reading. We are going to be primarily centering our conversation around Nicholas Carr's 2025 book, Superbloom: How Communication Technologies Separate Us.
Right, but we are also bringing in a ton of related insights. We've got sociology, some psychology, and a really deep look into the history of media.
Exactly, because the mission for this deep dive is to understand a very strange phenomenon. We want to figure out how the exact tools that were explicitly designed to connect humanity are, ironically, driving us further and further apart.
It is the defining paradox of our modern lives, I think. We have access to the sum total of human knowledge in our pockets,
Right.
but the environment it creates, well, it often feels less like an enlightened global village and more like a highly impulsive, emotionally volatile echo chamber.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the title of Carr's book, Superbloom, actually sets up the perfect metaphor for what we're experiencing. And to really get it, we have to look back at the spring of 2019.
Ah, the Walker Canyon incident.
Right. So heavy winter rains hit Walker Canyon in California, and it triggered this massive, breathtaking superbloom of bright orange poppies.
Just a stunning natural event.
Incredible. It was this beautiful, democratic explosion of nature. Anyone could just go and see it. But then, and this is where it turns an influencer with about 400,000 followers showed up, posted a stunning selfie right in the middle of the flowers, and the post went completely viral.
And that viral moment is where Carr's metaphor really takes shape. Because what started as this pure, accessible, beautiful phenomenon rapidly mutated. Hordes of tourists flooded the canyon.
Hordes of them.
Yes, and the sheer volume of people ended up literally trampling the very flowers they drove out to see. It became this chaotic flower-mageddon. They caused paralyzing traffic jams on the local highways. A police officer was actually injured in the chaos, and the local community was left completely outraged and exhausted.
And Carr looks at that crushed, trampled field of flowers and says, that is the internet.
Exactly. What begins as a beautiful, open explosion of free information quickly morphs into noise, chaos, and hostility simply because of the sheer volume and the frictionless speed of the traffic.
It's such a striking image, and Carr actually includes this really poignant personal reflection in the book. He talks about how he misses his old brain.
Right, the scuba diver analogy.
Yeah, he compares his past reading habits to being a scuba diver. Going deep into the quiet depths of a book or a long, thoughtful essay, immersing himself.
But now, after years of social media conditioning, he feels like a guy on a jet ski.
Just frantically bouncing across the surface of the water, never looking beneath the waves, just constantly moving on to the next brief stimulus.
I think you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who doesn't relate to that jet ski analogy on some level today. But I think it is really important to clarify what kind of critic Nicholas Carr actually is. He's not just an angry guy shaking his fist at a router.
No, not at all.
We can look at this through the lens of Isaac Asimov's concept of the relativity of wrong. Asimov pointed out that historically, people who believed the Earth was flat were wrong. Later on, people who believed the Earth was a perfect sphere were also wrong, because it's actually an oblate spheroid. It bulges at the equator.
Right, but the perfect sphere people were far less wrong than the flat earthers.
Precisely. So Carr isn't a flat earther here. He isn't claiming that all technology is inherently evil and that we need to smash our smartphones and go live off the grid in the woods.
Right.
He's what we might call a type 2 critic. He recognizes that our current operating belief, the idea that more digital connection is always inherently a good thing, is flawed. Much like thinking the Earth is a perfect sphere. The whole system doesn't need to be destroyed, but our approach to it needs a massive recalculation.
The baseline assumptions of the internet are slightly but fundamentally off. And to figure out how to adjust those coordinates, we actually have to look backward. Because one of the most striking things in this source material is how history just seems to copy-paste itself whenever a new communication technology is invented.
It is uncanny how often we repeat the same cycle of blind optimism.
Yes. The early pioneers always believed their new invention is going to usher in a flawless utopia. Back in 1897, the sociologist Charles Horton Cooley actually coined the term social media.
In 1897.
In 1897. And his theory was that faster, cheaper communication would breed perfect human understanding. And that perfect understanding would essentially cure all societal ills.
And you jump forward more than a century, and you have tech founders like Mark Zuckerberg echoing that exact same sentiment, almost word for word. The utopian idea that simply connecting the global community will automatically eradicate human conflict.
It's a very optimistic view of human nature. And we saw the exact same thing happen with radio, too. In 1898, Nikola Tesla and later Guglielmo Marconi around 1912, they were absolutely convinced that their wireless communication technology would put a permanent end to all wars.
Their logic was fairly straightforward, right? Wars are caused by misunderstandings. Wireless radio eliminates misunderstandings, therefore war becomes obsolete.
A beautiful piece of logic that was immediately followed by the outbreak of World War I.
Right. But there's a specific historical detail from the early days of radio that perfectly mirrors our current internet landscape. Between roughly 1910 and 1920, the radio ecosystem was essentially a free-for-all. Almost everyone who owned a radio receiver also had a transmitter.
So everybody was broadcasting their own personal messages simultaneously?
Exactly. It was a completely unregulated cacophony of voices.
And this is the part that really stuck with me. When the Titanic was sinking in 1912, a major part of the tragedy was that its distress signals were competing with thousands of amateur radio enthusiasts, people who were all just casually broadcasting at the exact same time.
Those early audio bloggers, essentially.
Yes. The operators on other ships couldn't hear the Titanic's calls for help because the signal was entirely drowned out by the chaotic noise of everyone just talking over each other. It was such a mess that Congress actually had to step in and regulate the airwaves just so people could communicate in an emergency.
It is a stark reminder that simply giving everyone a megaphone does not guarantee communication. Often it just guarantees noise. And what's fascinating here is that if we follow this thread to the 1930s, we see the dark side of that centralized regulation.
The rise of fascism.
Yes, Joseph Goebbels famously credited the radio for bringing the Nazis to power in Germany, because a centralized radio network was the perfect tool for a cheap, ubiquitous, one-way broadcast of pure propaganda.
Which naturally triggered a massive panic and a response in the United States. President Franklin D. Roosevelt actually formed a committee for national morale to study this exact threat.
And he brought in the absolute heavy hitters of the era.
He did. Anthropologist Margaret Mead, psychoanalyst Eric Fromm, psychologist Gordon Allport. Their entire job was to sit down and figure out how to design a media ecosystem that was completely fascism-proof.
And their conclusion is where the profound irony of our modern era really hits hard. The committee of brilliant minds determined that for a media environment to be safe and democratic, it needed 3 specific features.
Okay.
It had to be bidirectional, it had to be decentralized, and it had to be participatory. They believed that if every single citizen was simultaneously a producer and a consumer of information, a dictator could never seize control of the narrative.
Wait, they basically drew up the exact blueprint for modern social media?
They absolutely did. It is totally decentralized, everyone participates, and it goes in every direction all at once. They designed what they thought was the ultimate structural antidote to authoritarian control.
Yet here we are, living inside their utopian blueprint, and the system is heavily implicated in political polarization, the spread of misinformation, and just a general fracturing of the social fabric.
It turns out that decentralization didn't eliminate the chaos, it just democratized it.
It brings to mind that point Nate Silver makes in his book, The Signal and the Noise. We all learn in school that Gutenberg's printing press was this monumental triumph that spread the scientific revolution and widespread literacy.
The standard textbook narrative.
Right. But we forget that it also made it incredibly cheap and easy to mass distribute cult manifestos, superstitions, witch hunting manuals, and pamphlets that literally fueled centuries of religious wars. The medium itself is neutral, it just amplifies whatever human nature feeds into it.
Which leads us to ask, if the architecture of social media is exactly what those 1930s intellectuals wanted, what is the variable that makes it so volatile today? Why is it separating us? And the answer seems to come down to frictionless speed and the way algorithms weaponize our emotions.
Let's talk about friction, because the sources offer a great visual comparison here. Think about Johannes Vermeer's painting. Girl reading a letter at an open window. She's standing there in this quiet, natural light, totally absorbed in a piece of paper.
It's a very peaceful, contemplative image.
Historically, sending and receiving a letter was a very high-friction process. It was slow, it cost money, and writing one forced you to sit down and actually reflect on what you wanted to say.
And the person reading it had the time and space to process their emotional reaction before they even thought about drafting a reply.
Digital speed entirely removes that pause. We've transitioned from the slow, deliberate processing of the letter reader to the hyper-reactive processing demanded by an algorithm.
A major turning point in this transition was the invention of the retweet button in 2009.
Oh, this is a crucial piece of the puzzle.
It really is. Before that button existed, if you wanted to share someone else's thought on Twitter, you had to manually highlight the text, copy it, paste it into a new draft, and maybe type out your own commentary before posting.
That manual process is friction. It gave you a few seconds to think, wait, do I actually agree with this? Is this even true?
Precisely. The retweet button erased that friction entirely. Suddenly, you could amplify a message to thousands of people with a single, unthinking tap. Chris Wetherell, the developer who actually built that button, later looked back on it with deep regret. He compared the invention to handing a loaded weapon to a 4-year-old.
Wow.
Because it stripped away our capacity for a thoughtful pause. It turned us into impulsive relay nodes in a massive network.
And the algorithms powering those networks are optimized to trigger very specific impulses. There was a landmark study in 2018 published in the journal Science by a researcher named Soroush Vosoughi.
A very revealing study.
They analyzed how information spreads online, particularly false news. And the finding wasn't that people are inherently gullible or stupid. It was that the algorithm disproportionately rewards the emotions of surprise and disgust.
Right.
If you see a headline that makes you physically recoil or gasp in disbelief, your impulse to hit that frictionless share button goes through the roof. Disgust has basically become the reserve currency of the digital economy.
Furthermore, when disgust and surprise dictate what goes viral, we run straight into a cognitive vulnerability known as the illusion of truth.
How does that work?
Well, cognitive neuroscientists like Telly Sherot and Cass Sunstein have shown that the human brain relies heavily on repetition as a heuristic for factuality. If you see a specific claim repeated just 5 times across your social feeds, your brain automatically begins to encode it as true.
Even if you consciously know the source is dubious.
Yes, that is the insidious part of it. The actual factual merit of the claim becomes entirely secondary to the frequency of exposure. The sheer repetition hacks our cognitive defenses. It makes us susceptible to narratives we might otherwise completely dismiss.
Here's where it gets really interesting, especially when we look at how this affects our actual physical relationships.
Yeah.
Because in the physical world, meat-space communities, like a small town or even just an office building, we are protected by a sociological concept called an emotional vaccine.
This is such a vital concept to understand.
Imagine you have a neighbor. Maybe they hold the elevator door for you, or they help you jumpstart your car one morning when you're late for work. Over time, you build a baseline of positive human interaction with them.
You've established a multi-dimensional view of them as a complex person.
Right. So 6 months later, if you find out that this same neighbor holds a political opinion that you strongly disagree with, your reaction is naturally tempered. The anger is neutralized, or at least kept in check, by the emotional vaccine of that shared human connection. You know they are a person capable of kindness, even if you hate their politics.
But that mechanism breaks down completely on social media. Because online, we don't get the holistic view of a person. We receive what psychologists refer to as a thin slice.
A thin slice?
Yes, we get a 15-second glimpse into a stranger's life.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a highly curated vacation photo boasting about their wealth, or a brief angry political rant, or just an out-of-context video clip. Our brains, which evolved to make very quick judgments for survival, take that tiny slice and use it to judge their entire core identity.
It makes total sense why so many people have an intuitive, almost visceral fear of being filmed in public these days. They recognize that if they have just one bad moment, if they look angry at a barista or make a poor joke or just look messy for 1 second, that single thin slice can be broadcast to millions.
Exactly. They are robbed of their complex human agency and permanently reduced to their worst 15 seconds in the eyes of total strangers.
And this leads to a really counterintuitive finding about how much we actually want to know about each other.
You're referring to the dating study by Michael Norton and Dan Riley.
I am. It's fascinating. They found that as people receive more data about a potential partner, they actually find more reasons to dislike them.
We always tend to assume that more information leads to greater affection or deeper understanding, but social media forces us to absorb an unnatural amount of mundane, irritating details about the lives of acquaintances and strangers. It cultivates this baseline state of low-level contempt. Familiarity breeds contempt, quite literally.
That perfectly explains the echo chamber paradox we see in Chris Bale's research. Bale ran a study where he took staunch, highly partisan Democrats and Republicans and actually paid them to follow Twitter bots. And these bots exclusively retweeted the opposing party's viewpoints into their feeds for a full month.
Now, the prevailing wisdom going all the way back to the Charles Horton Cooley utopian view of social media would suggest that this exposure should build bridges. If we just step outside our information bubbles and hear the other side, we will naturally develop empathy.
But the results were the exact opposite.
Completely the opposite.
After a month of forced exposure to the other side, both the Democrats and the Republicans became significantly more radicalized. They became far more entrenched in their original views. And I want to be clear here, this wasn't a one-sided effect. It impacted both ends of the political spectrum equally.
It is a striking failure of the marketplace of ideas concept when it is applied to a frictionless digital space. Hearing an opposing viewpoint from a 15-second digital slice of an anonymous stranger does not foster empathy. It triggers a tribal threat response.
Because there's no emotional vaccine.
Exactly. Without the human friction of that vaccine, different perspectives aren't seen as ideas to debate. They are just perceived as hostile attacks.
So we've established the mechanics of the Jetski Brain, the algorithm's love of disgust, and the loss of our emotional vaccines. Let's look at the real-world fallout. What is the actual, measurable human toll this takes on our daily lives and our mental health?
The data presents a very sobering, very painful picture of how deeply these systems impact human flourishing. If we look at Jonathan Haidt's work on the anxious generation, he points to a critical inflection point right around 2012.
When smartphones really took over.
Exactly. Yeah. This is the period when social media transitioned from something you did occasionally in a desktop computer to a ubiquitous, always-on presence in our pockets. And immediately following that shift, there is a terrifying hockey stick spike in youth anxiety, clinical depression, and self-harm rates.
It's heartbreaking.
It really is. And this trend is particularly pronounced among young girls who are spending 5 or more hours a day on highly visual, comparative platforms. They are suffering immensely.
We're looking at an entire generation trying to develop their core identities in an environment their neurology simply wasn't built to process. And it is literally keeping humanity awake.
The sleep data is incredibly telling.
It's stark. Back in 1991, roughly 25 to 32% of teenagers were getting less than 7 hours of sleep a night. Today, that number sits between 40 and 50%. Nearly half of all teens are chronically sleep deprived.
And it's not just the blue light from the screens, though, that plays a part. It is the lingering anxiety of digital combat. It's the fear of missing out, the stress of constant interruptions. It prevents the nervous system from ever truly winding down.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the neurological impacts can manifest in ways that are almost difficult to believe.
Yes. We connect this to the bigger picture. Consider the phenomenon of mass sociogenic illness, or MSMI. There's deeply concerning, well-documented case involving a German content creator named Jan Zimmerman. He genuinely suffers from Tourette's syndrome, and he uses his platform to raise awareness about his condition.
Which is a noble goal.
It is. However, because algorithmic video feeds create such an intense sense of intimate frequency, highly suggestible viewers began to physically absorb his behaviors.
They started mirroring him.
Yes. Thousands of teenagers who watched him develop genuine psychogenic cells. They began uncontrollably shouting the exact same random phrases he did, like flying shark. It proves how deeply a digital platform can hijack our neurological pathways.
That is wild. Physical proof of digital influence. And it doesn't just change our involuntary kinetics, it changes our voluntary behavior, specifically how we judge and police each other online.
The moral grandstanding.
Yes. We see a massive rise in social vigilantism. People who dedicate their time to constantly calling out others online, positioning themselves as the ultimate moral arbiters of society.
On the surface, that behavior looks like a deep commitment to ethics and justice. But psychological profiles of individuals who frequently engage in this online social policing reveal a very different underlying motivation.
What do the profiles show?
These individuals often score unusually high in impulsivity, narcissism, and even sadistic traits. They are effectively utilizing the cultural guise of morality to legitimize bullying behavior. It satisfies a personal desire for dominance and status, rather than any real ethical concern.
It is a pretty bleak landscape when you lay it all out like that. Which brings us to the ultimate question. So, what does this all mean? How do we fix this without acting like flat earthers and just unplugging the internet completely?
Nicholas Carr advocates for a concept he calls frictional design.
Frictional design.
Yes, if frictionless speed is the primary driver of the chaos, then intentional friction is the antidote. We need to actively architect moments of reflection back into our digital spaces. We have to slow the internet down.
Like adding digital speed bumps.
Exactly. Imagine if a platform forced a mandatory 60-second cooldown period before you could publish an angry reply to a thread. Just a minute to breathe.
Or what if, when you try to hit share on an article, a prompt pops up saying, "Our analytics show you haven't actually read this article. Are you sure you want to share it with your followers?"
It is about mechanically recreating the thoughtful pause of the Vermeer letter reader. We have to design systems that protect us from our own impulsive biology, giving the rational brain a chance to catch up with the emotional reaction.
But there's a fascinating prediction from the sources about where this is all actually heading, and it has to do with artificial intelligence.
This is a wild pivot, but highly plausible.
Right now, social media is chaotic because the consumer and the producer are the exact same person. It's us, millions of humans shouting over each other. But generative AI is advancing at such a rapid clip, creating high-quality text, audio, and video almost instantly.
The prediction is that AI will eventually become so proficient at content creation that it will simply outcompete human creators entirely. The barrier to entry to get any attention will become impossibly high for a normal person.
And when that happens, everyday humans will likely stop trying to produce content and just revert to being passive consumers, meaning we go right back to the 1930s broadcast model.
Exactly. It's a profound irony. Instead of a decentralized superbloom of messy human voices, we return to a centralized model where AI systems broadcast to a quiet, consuming audience. It might cure the chaotic noise and the hyperpolarization, but at the cost of the entire democratization of the internet.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We started with the physical trampling of the Walker Canyon Superbloom. We looked back at the Titanic's distress signals getting lost in amateur radio noise, and we explored the weaponization of the retweet button.
And we've seen how the loss of the emotional vaccine fuels echo chambers, and how the frictionless speed of it all is taking a measurable heavy toll on our sleep and our mental health.
It really is.
It leaves us with a final, profound thought to ponder. If artificial intelligence eventually silences the chaotic noise of human social media by doing all the talking for us, will we finally find the peace of mind we've been longing for since the era of slow, handwritten letters?
That's the big question.
Or will we realize that we've simply traded the messy, exhausting freedom of the Superbloom for a perfectly curated artificial silence?
What an incredible thought to leave off on. Thank you to everyone listening for pulling up a chair and spending time with us today at the Philosophy Cafe. You've given us a lot to think about, and we hope you keep exploring these ideas on your own. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.